J'invite maintenant Jeanne Doering à venir prendre la parole. Elle est professeure émérite de l'Université de Notre-Dame aux USA. Elle a publié plusieurs livres en anglais. The Christian Platonism of Simone Weil, qui est un livre qu'elle a coédité. Et enfin, un livre de son cru, The Spectre of Self-Perpetuating Force. Et elle annonce pour bientôt un autre livre, un autre ouvrage, When Fiction and Philosophy Meet, A Conversation with Flannery O'Connor and Simone Weil. Et Jeanne Doering va nous parler en anglais, donc ce ne sera pas traduit, nous comptons sur votre compétence linguistique, pour nous parler de Simone Weil and the Empire of Force.
I do want to thank you, Aviad and Denis, for inviting us to share in your celebration. In 1951, as the first English translations appeared in the United States, an American Jewish literary critic, Leslie Fielder, wrote a perceptive critical introduction to Waiting for God. I quote, he said, "In 8 scant years, this young French woman has come to possess the imagination of many in the Western world. Catholic and Protestant, Christian and Jew, agnostic and devout, we have all turned to her with profound conviction that the meaning of her experience is our meaning, that she is really ours." So I think it's just wonderful to have this celebration together today on the Hebrew translations. Penetratingly critical of certain aspects of her thought in the first blush of its arrival onto the public scene, Fielder is an unabashed admirer of the purity and the clarity of the expression of her thought. Purity of thought is what Simone Weil most desired for her thinking, and for that of others in their efforts to resolve the perpetual problems integral to human existence, not the least of which is the prevalence of destructive force in daily life. She believed that the drive to exert force over others is inherent in human nature, that human beings, subject to the same laws as the cosmos, have an innate moral gravity that affects all decision-making. She writes in her notebooks that by an imperative of nature, all human beings, whenever they are able, exercise all the power at their disposal. Throughout her writings, she describes the variety of ways that force has been tirelessly exerted against other human beings, from humiliating working conditions, impending death threats, cruel uprooting of human souls from nourishing communities, to abject slavery and death. She writes, quote, "To define force, it is that X that turns anybody who is subjected to it into a thing. Exercised to the limit, it makes a corpse of a human being," unquote. That is, turns him back into matter. Our reflections here will explore the genesis and early itinerary of her conviction that, quote, "the empire of force is as extensive as the empire of nature," end quote. We will highlight certain signposts that indicate the direction of her path toward that conviction as seen in her actions, her study of philosophy, her teaching of literature, and her writing, up to the summation of her thought in her much appreciated essay, much appreciated essay, The Iliad, or the Poem of Force. Force and empathy for its victims was always a part of Simone Weil's life. Her experiences, real and vicarious, led her to incorporate with an analytically philosophical method each expansion of her thought into her writings and teachings. She uncovered the explicit and implicit social pressures that obfuscate an individual's opportunity to think clearly and independently. A tenet of her belief is that truth is an object of thought. Piercing the veil of truth through experience and reflection opens one to recognizing the sacredness of every person. She believed that the mind must be able to operate freely and develop the capacity to critically analyze by means of a moral criterion society's many ways of repressing human contemplation and imposing its will through force. Her ultimate goal was to understand oppression, as well as the social conditions that allow individuals to safeguard their human dignity, their ability to freely consent to the human condition, and to know that society respects their worth as human beings. Oppression for Weil includes all aspects of the social structure that hinder individuals from exercising their faculties in order to experience reality to the fullest extent. She describes her ultimate aim: to conceive a society in which collective life would be subject to persons as individuals instead of subjecting them to itself. One must visualize a form of material existence wherein only efforts exclusively directed by a clear intelligence would take place. As a labor activist, she believed that awareness of the real comes from an organization of daily work, preferably manual work, that fosters a renewal of the original pact between the mind and the universe. In her early writings, a reader can discern her exasperation as she deploys sharply honed rhetorical skills to convince the workers to struggle together against inhuman working conditions. Coherent thinking reveals the obvious, that those who do the manual labor are more numerous than those who direct the laborers. Therein lies their strength. Nevertheless, the workers fail to cooperate among themselves in order to confront their oppressors in an effective way. Her frustration radiates from every line, and her overriding goal becomes finding the material conditions that best foster precious clarity of thought. Her exasperation reveals traces of her study of the 16th century political theorist Étienne de la Boétie and his Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, or Against One, and the 18th century Enlightenment philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his Social Contract. La Boétie relies on two fundamental premises. First, a well-operating society rests on consent of the masses. And second, natural liberty has great social value. She fully believed in these precepts, but then, observing the mass of workers allowing themselves to be shackled by the few in management, made her only too aware of a boundless obstacle in her search for an efficacious defense against undue social and physical force. As she tried to reason out the parameters of force within her perception of human nature, she had to consider the contradiction that greater numbers do not necessarily add up to a more practicable counterforce. On the contrary, too often, numbers can signify weakness. She gives as an example France's colonial domination in Indochina, profoundly immoral in her mind, in which 20 men in the streets could easily beat up a single man. But it took only 1 or 2 white men to mercilessly whip 20 Annamite coolies. From this type of situation, she recognized the reality that a small group could establish cohesiveness and power, while a larger group remained a cumbersome juxtaposition of individuals, with little defense against tyrannous rule. Historically, the situation of enslaving Africans substantiates this unfortunate actuality of human nature. On any established plantation, the slaves, while outnumbering the masters, still had to submit to abominable mistreatment. Despite all her efforts to encourage workers to stand together to proclaim their desperate need for more humane working conditions, she concluded that a moderate use of force, enabling man to escape from being enmeshed in its machinery, requires superhuman virtue. Unfortunately, such virtue is as rare as dignity in weakness. At the heart of Reflections on the Causes of Liberty and Social Oppression, her lengthy overview of material conditions that comprise both oppression and liberty, she inverts Rousseau's key statement in The Social Contract. His reads, "Man is born free and everywhere is in chains." Her somewhat ironic twist is, it would seem that man was born a slave and that slavery is his natural condition. She bolsters, nevertheless, her confidence in the power of human thought by continuing. At the same time, nothing on earth can stop man from feeling himself born for liberty. Never, whatever may happen, can he accept servitude, for he is a thinking creature. Once again, La Boétie sheds some light on this anomaly in human psychology, that a human being, albeit born for liberty, submits to social oppression. This founder of French modern political philosophy suggests that custom has more influence on human malleability than the influence of native ability. He writes, "It cannot be denied that nature is influential in shaping us to her will and making us reveal our rich or meager endowment. Yet it must be admitted that she, nature, has less power over us than custom, for the reason that native endowment, no matter how good, is subsumed, unless nurtured, whereas environment always shapes us in its own way, whatever that may be, in spite of nature's gifts." Simone Weil's experience in the factory corroborates this insight into human psychology. The conditions there had so thoroughly crushed her self-esteem that she felt debased to the point of being an object without value, much to her own astonishment. This fact of human nature supports the need for what Weil would later call an apprenticeship in virtue, for it is only within extraordinarily rare individuals that virtuous behavior can persist in defiance of onerous and highly restrictive conditions. Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, and Nelson Mandela courageously refused to accept the entrenched, oppressive status quo. Their apprenticeship cost them dearly, but even today, society benefits from their virtuous and selfless determination to insist on equal respect for all persons. A major element in her teaching stresses the way relationships of force develop from conditions of unequal respect for all. Her preparatory notes for several courses reveal her imaginative use of literature as a springboard for her students' reflections. The fact that she included Saint-Exupéry's novel Night Flight 3 times on her syllabi makes her class preparation a worthy focus for our attention here. Her plan was to challenge her students to uncover the weak points in Saint-Exupéry's idealistic image of human beings, depending on themselves alone as they work toward a common goal that surpasses present human achievement. She juxtaposes that concept with her own terse counter-affirmation for her students. Quote, "Social relationships are essentially relationships of force." This is the first time she uses so strongly the word force. Her notes and those of an attentive student reveal her intent to make a social analysis of the literary work Night Flight, highlighting the ambivalence of the hierarchy's role in its need to diminish the power of the more numerous underlings. She implies that a collectivity so inclined is symbolic of Plato's great beast. In its severest form, however, such power paves the way to war. Saint-Exupéry's impersonal hierarchy rules over a tightly compressed group of men, all oriented toward a single challenging goal. In this case, success for the night mail flights. The main protagonist, Rivière the director, represents the callous, unseen authorities steering the newly formed airline company. Fabien is the pilot whose assimilation of the company's mores will cost him dearly. The lowly mechanics and the inspector are the compliance symbols of the authoritarian structure of the company. In her analysis of this compact clutch of men, Weil wants her students to recognize the ambivalence in the vital social role that hierarchy plays. It is necessary but treacherous. Consequently, the imperative within any well-functioning group is to assure an appropriate balance between those who question and those who submit. She explains that a cold, indifferent hierarchy exerting overarching force on its subordinates stifles freedom of thought, loses its direction, and is analogous to a truck that plows forward blindly even after its conductor has suddenly died. Weil's teaching plans for night flight begin between 1933 and 1937, and they show a progression from a speculative approach they show a progression from a speculative approach toward social interactions to more concrete concerns about social structures that reduce individuals to things. By 1937, however, she has experienced reprehensible behavior perpetrated on both sides of the Spanish Civil War, which revealed starkly that people with the power to kill ruthlessly crush the powerless. She discovered that whoever has a pistol and can use it with impunity will do so, and even take pleasure in the act of killing. Notwithstanding night flight's popular reception, Weil discerns a perilous ambiguity in Saint-Exupéry's secular view of humanity. She questions his portrayal of man's subordination to a supposedly higher material goal. One can detect a residue of the fallout from her devastating experience on the industrial assembly line. Authority over others is necessary, but a limited authority, one that never diminishes another's humanity. In dialectical fashion, she questions Saint-Exupéry's philosophical premises underlying the need to mold followers into objects of obedience willing to immolate themselves for an exterior goal. To her mind, this type of social structure demeans individual thinking, sacrifices lives needlessly, and creates substantial activity of uncertain value while deflecting any questions on the part of those who carry out the activity. In night flight, Fabien is an experienced aviator determined to navigate his airplane in the dark over the Cordilleras of the Andes, which has the second highest mountain peaks in the world. Because he has internalized the company's goals, valuing them over his own, he will sacrifice his life by attempting to do the impossible during a raging cyclone. Reveling in the potential of achieving superhuman heights of valor, enjoying the sensation of triumph after each successful mail delivery over the Andes and smarting over the sardonic goads of Rivière, Fabien is motivated to exceed his capacities and that of his airplane. He fatally crashes in the mountains. Despite that outcome, Saint-Exupéry effusively describes the sensations of such a courageous pilot. Quote, "When he has crossed a dozen storms like lands at war, between the neutral tracks of moonlight, to reach at last those lights, one following the other, He knows himself a conqueror, end quote. The signal lights for Saint-Exupéry signaled the solidarity of men. Together, they can surpass existent human accomplishments to achieve the superhuman. For him, this comradeship of men, exerting themselves to the extreme, gives sense to human existence. But Weil asks her students the pertinent question: who has the rights over the pilots' lives? The company, the stockholders, those who write the letters, those who receive the mail, those who plan the routes, the prestige of France? Her response is that while none in particular do, this reality reveals the indispensable function of hierarchical structures, which must dissuade any probing inquiries. The hierarchy must appear superhuman, because its intended effect is to render human life inhuman. The hierarchy succeeds in the small commercial airline of Saint-Exupéry's narration, for it eventually becomes Air France in 1933. In his heroic humanist view of life, Saint-Exupéry saw this progression as exemplary of what civilization could achieve by exerting human abilities to the utmost limits and beyond, through resolute action aimed toward fortuitous outcomes initially scarcely imagined. Hierarchy built into the social structure permits this process to take place. Weil saw hierarchy as mirroring necessity, which could be a good thing. Conditions of life should reflect those of the universe. A steadfast hierarchy is needed to have a smoothly functioning society, for it can't survive if too many members question authority. Yet she warns against extreme domination that smothers human thought, the most essential human quality. In Saint-Exupéry's virtual society, everyone is a potential propitiatory victim for something considered greater than what material life offers. Weil discerns in Rivière an incarnation of the notion of unwavering authority, which signifies strong discipline, but inevitably injustice. She explains that the body does not react to injustice, but it does to necessity. She compares his obligations as supervisor to an animal obedience trainer, using treats or a whip and an imposing air. For the responsibility of a director is to train, to discipline, and to form pliant workers, not to reason with them. Everything is a mixture of good and evil. So Weil recommends first identifying conditions that diminish human beings, then reducing those situations to the absolute minimum. She writes in her notebook, "The collectivity should have as much need as possible of the individual, that is, of his or her thought." She provokes her students to reflect on the fact that a collectivity's very existence depends on maneuvering between two dangers: the one of perpetrating injustice through unswerving single-mindedness, and the other of crumbling internally by neglecting to inculcate compliancy. She suggests that the major political problem in any collectivity is to create a balance between reflection and tractability, constantly aware that big ideas rarely motivate changes in human lives. A rigorous structure of command must exclude introspection. Consequently, the company or country assumes a religious aura, analogous to an idol, to which individuals owe allegiance. Once the process is launched and blood is spilled, doubting becomes an act of impiety, because the revered object of attention becomes sacred. She suggests that this revolving cycle of self-destruction becomes possible because too few persons reflect on the myriad ways that social relationships are based on force. But when this force becomes too encompassing, it suppresses the ability of individuals to contribute nourishing ideas. Thus, starving the collectivity of vital sustenance. Such a society becomes a blind mechanism, pitting the individuals against the great beast. The collectivity is impelled into a lifeless, perpetual motion until it wears out or self-destructs, harming many innocent people. Weil reflects, ironically, that modern man thinks himself superior to those who make human sacrifices to idols. But not so, she says. We are all the same. The pinnacle of this self-immolating idolatry is war, which becomes a superior divinity that requires sacrifice even to the point of destroying civilization. In such an atmosphere of conflict, a legitimate bitterness replaces justice and love, for the human spirit is relentlessly subjected to force, which means being reduced to matter or a thing. In conclusion, Simone Weil's reflection on force are eminently applicable today, with cruelty imposed on the vulnerable throughout the world. Weil tells us that we are complicit in creating conditions that foster humiliating workers, uprooting cultures, enslaving the defenseless, and killing fellow human beings. Although she makes a case that this moral gravity is part of our human nature, she urges an apprenticeship of virtue that could mitigate these horrors. She warns, quote, "Only he who has measured the dominion of force and knows how not to respect it is capable of love and justice." She urges her readers not to hate the enemy or to scorn the unfortunate, for no one escapes human suffering. Above all, one must learn how to recognize, yet not to admire, the empire of force.